Jet combat in the Korean War moved faster than any air war before it. Fighters climbed above the clouds and met near the speed of sound. American Sabres hunted Soviet-designed MiG fighters along the Yalu River, and the pilots flying them had only seconds to react once a fight began. A mistake at that speed was final. In that violent stretch of sky, one quiet Air Force captain built a record no American pilot would beat during the war. Between January and May 1953, Joseph C. McConnell Jr. shot down 16 MiG-15 fighters, becoming the highest-scoring American ace of the Korean War. His victories came fast. His fame came faster. But the story of Joseph McConnell didn't begin in Korea, and it didn't end there either. Joseph Christopher McConnell Jr. was born on January 30th, 1922, in Dover, New Hampshire. McConnell grew up in a working-class household. His father worked as a barber, and the family lived a modest but stable life. Like many boys growing up during the 1920s and 1930s, Joseph became fascinated with airplanes. He built model airplanes and read about aviation whenever he could find something to read. For him, flying wasn't just interesting, it was the future he imagined for himself. His childhood, however, wasn't without hardship. When Joseph was 9 years old, his mother died after a short illness. The loss changed the family's life in ways that were difficult for a child to fully understand. It forced him to grow up faster than he might have otherwise. By the late 1930s, the world was moving steadily toward war. Germany had invaded Poland in 1939, fighting had spread across Europe, and the United States was beginning to expand its military in preparation for the possibility of entering the conflict. For a young man who wanted to fly, the military offered the most direct path to an aircraft cockpit. In October 1940, at 18 years old, Joseph McConnell enlisted in the United States Army. His goal was simple. He wanted to become a military pilot. The path to that goal, however, would turn out to be longer than he expected. At the time McConnell enlisted, the Army Air Corps accepted only a limited number of candidates for pilot training. Many applicants were turned away or assigned to other aviation roles. McConnell was one of them. Instead of entering pilot's training, he was assigned to the Army's medical department. The job had little to do with airplanes, and for a young man who had enlisted to fly, it was a frustrating start. But McConnell didn't give up on his plan. He continued applying for aviation training and watching for opportunities to move closer to flight operations. The important thing, at least in his mind, was staying inside the military aviation system long enough to reach the cockpit eventually. McConnell believed the opportunity to fly would eventually appear if he remained close to military aviation. Leaving the Army would mean starting over somewhere else. Staying meant waiting for the right moment. In December 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II, and the size of the American military expanded rapidly. Aviation suddenly became one of the most important parts of the war effort. Bombers, fighters, and transport aircraft were needed in enormous numbers. That expansion created opportunities. McConnell applied again for aviation training and was eventually accepted into the Army Air Force's Aviation Cadet Program. It was the closest he had yet come to the cockpit. But there was another obstacle. McConnell was assigned to navigator training. It wasn't the job he originally wanted, but it placed him inside the world of combat aviation, and that mattered more than the exact role. McConnell completed the program and earned his navigator wings. He was commissioned as a second lieutenant and prepared for overseas service. By this point, the war in Europe was in full swing. American bombers were flying daily missions against targets deep inside Nazi Germany. Crews faced heavy anti-aircraft fire and aggressive fighter defenses. Many missions didn't return. McConnell soon found himself assigned to one of the most dangerous jobs in the air war. He would navigate a bomber through hostile skies over Europe, helping guide the aircraft to its target and back again. He was assigned to a bomber unit flying the B-24 Liberator, one of the main heavy bombers used by the United States during World War II. Even a small error in navigation could send a bomber formation miles off target. McConnell deployed to England as part of the American air campaign against Nazi Germany. From airfields across eastern England, heavy bomber formations took off daily and headed toward industrial centers, rail yards, factories, and oil facilities inside occupied Europe. These missions were long and dangerous. Bomber crews sometimes spent 8 hours or more in the air. They flew at high altitude in tight formations designed to protect each other with overlapping fields of defensive gunfire. Flying these missions demanded discipline and teamwork. Every man on the aircraft depended on the others to do his job correctly. A mistake by one crew member could endanger everyone on board. McConnell absorbed those lessons quickly. People who served with him later often described him as calm and methodical. Bomber crews valued those qualities. Panic and hesitation had no place inside an aircraft flying through heavy flak and fighter attacks. For Joseph McConnell, the conflict had provided valuable combat experience. He had served inside the world of military aviation and learned how air combat operations worked. He hadn't yet become a pilot. McConnell had spent the war navigating bombers across hostile skies, but he had never sat in the pilot seat of a combat aircraft. After the war, the military began reorganizing and modernizing its aviation forces. Technology had advanced rapidly during the conflict, and new aircraft were already being developed. At the same time, the United States was entering a new period of global tension that would later be known as the Cold War. That changing environment created new opportunities. In 1946, McConnell was finally accepted into pilot training. Over the next 2 years, he completed flight training and learned to fly a variety of aircraft used by the post-war Army Air Forces. In February 1948, he graduated from pilot training at Williams Air Force Base in Arizona. At last, Joseph McConnell had his pilot wings. In 1947, the United States created an independent air service known as the United States Air Force. He flew several different aircraft during the early years of the Air Force and gained experience as a jet pilot during a period when the technology was still evolving. The new fighters required faster reactions and a deeper understanding of high-speed flight. For pilots who mastered them, they also offered extraordinary performance. Jet fighters from both sides soon met in combat high above the Korean Peninsula. It was the first large-scale war in which jet aircraft fought each other in the air. For pilots in the United States Air Force, Korea became the place where reputations were made. Joseph McConnell wanted to be part of that fight. At first, however, the Air Force hesitated to send him. By the early 1950s, McConnell was older than many of the younger fighter pilots entering combat units. Some commanders believed younger pilots were better suited for the intense demands of jet combat. McConnell disagreed. He pushed for a combat assignment and continued requesting a transfer to a fighter unit deployed to Korea. Eventually, the Air Force approved the request. In September 1952, Joseph McConnell arrived in Korea. He was assigned to the 39th Fighter Interceptor Squadron, part of the 51st Fighter Wing. The unit flew one of the most capable jet fighters of the era, the North American F-86 Sabre. Their opponent was the Soviet-designed McConnell Jr. MiG-15. Most of the air fighting in Korea took place along the northwestern corner of the country near the Yalu River. Pilots gave that stretch of sky a name that soon became famous, MiG Alley. It was here that American Sabres and communist MiG fighters met almost daily. Both aircraft were fast, heavily armed, and flown by skilled pilots. Some of the enemy aviators were Chinese or North Korean. Others were Soviet pilots flying secretly in the conflict. Dogfights often began suddenly. Two formations might spot each other miles away and begin maneuvering for position. Within moments, the aircraft would be turning, climbing, and diving at high speed while pilots searched for a firing solution. The MiG-15 had advantages in climb rate and heavy cannon armament. The Sabre, however, had strengths of its own. It was stable during high-speed maneuvers and provided an excellent gun platform. Sabre pilots relied on positioning and teamwork to gain the advantage before opening fire. McConnell flew regular patrols over MiG Alley during the fall and winter of 1952. Early missions brought plenty of encounters with enemy fighters, but victories didn't come easily. Many capable pilots flew dozens of combat sorties before scoring their first confirmed kill. Air combat at jet speed left little margin for error. McConnell spent those early missions learning the rhythm of jet dogfighting. He watched how experienced pilots approached an attack, how they positioned their aircraft before firing, and how they disengaged when a fight turned against them. Gradually, his confidence improved. Then, on January 14, 1953, the waiting ended. During a fight with MiG fighters over northern Korea, McConnell maneuvered into position behind one of the enemy aircraft and opened fire. The MiG broke apart and fell away. After months of combat patrols, Joseph McConnell had scored his first victory. Once Joseph McConnell scored his first victory, the pace of events changed quickly. That first success proved something important. It showed that the long months of learning and patience had paid off. McConnell now understood how to fight effectively in the jet battles over Korea. And once he began scoring victories, they started coming faster. Jet fights gave pilots almost no time to recover from mistakes. Pilots had to watch the sky in every direction while flying an aircraft moving hundreds of miles per hour. The difference between hunter and target could change in seconds. McConnell developed a reputation for sharp eyesight and careful positioning. Instead of rushing into a fight, he looked for the moment when an enemy aircraft made a mistake. When that moment came, he attacked quickly. His aircraft carried a name painted on the side of the fuselage: Beauteous Butch. The nickname came from his wife, Pearl. Every Sabre he flew in Korea carried the same name, making the aircraft easy to recognize among other fighters in the squadron. As the winter of 1953 turned towards spring, McConnell's victories continued to accumulate. Each successful mission added to his reputation among the Sabre pilots flying combat patrols over Korea. Fighter units paid close attention to confirmed victories because they represented proof that a pilot had mastered the difficult balance between aggression and survival. A fighter pilot had to attack with confidence, but recklessness could be fatal. McConnell seemed to understand that balance. His approach relied on positioning rather than dramatic maneuvers. He worked to place his aircraft in the right location before firing. Once he had that advantage, the Sabre's 6 50 caliber machine guns could do their work quickly. One enemy fighter after another fell to his guns. Within a few weeks, McConnell had moved well beyond his first victory. Pilots who scored 5 confirmed kills were officially recognized as aces. That milestone had always carried prestige in fighter aviation. McConnell passed it. Then he continued adding victories. His success didn't mean the danger had disappeared. Every mission still carried the possibility of disaster. Enemy pilots were skilled, and the high speeds of jet combat meant that a single mistake could place a pilot directly in an opponent's gun sight. On April 12, 1953, McConnell experienced how quickly that situation could develop. During a fight with enemy fighters, his Sabre was hit. The aircraft became uncontrollable, and McConnell had no choice but to eject. His parachute carried him down into the cold waters of the Yellow Sea. Ejecting from a jet fighter was already a dangerous process. Landing in open water added another layer of risk. Pilots who parachuted into the sea could easily drown or die from exposure if rescue forces didn't reach them quickly. McConnell was fortunate. A rescue helicopter arrived and pulled him from the water before the situation became fatal. The recovery placed him safely back with American forces. Many pilots might have taken time away from combat after such an experience. McConnell returned to flying missions. The incident didn't slow the pace of his victories. By this point, his name was becoming widely known within the fighter wings operating in Korea. Pilots paid attention when someone consistently returned from missions with confirmed kills. He wasn't known for dramatic stories or exaggerated claims. Fellow pilots described him as quiet and focused, the kind of man who preferred flying the mission over talking about it afterward. That reputation mattered. In fighter aviation, credibility depended on performance. Pilots trusted the opinions of men who had proven themselves in combat. By the spring of 1953, Joseph McConnell had done exactly that. His victories had accumulated steadily through the first months of the year. Each mission offered another opportunity for the record to grow. At the same time, the Korean War itself was approaching a turning point. Armistice negotiations had been underway for months. While fighting continued, many observers believed the war might end soon. Fighter pilots still flying combat patrols knew that their time in the air war could be limited. For McConnell, the closing months of the conflict became the most productive period of his combat career. Enemy fighters continued appearing in the skies over northern Korea, and Sabre pilots continued intercepting them. McConnell's total climbed higher. What had begun with a single victory in January was becoming a remarkable streak of success. 15 victories placed a pilot in an extremely small group within fighter aviation history. Pilots who reached that number were often called triple aces. They had reached 3 times the traditional ace score. Reaching that mark during the short span of the Korean War would be extraordinary. McConnell moved closer to it with each mission. During these engagements, he continued attacking enemy fighters and adding to his score. By the time those missions ended, McConnell had destroyed 16 enemy aircraft. All of those victories had occurred in only 4 months. The total placed him ahead of every other American pilot flying in the Korean War. No other U.S. pilot would surpass his record during the conflict. For his actions in combat, McConnell received the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest award for valor in the United States military. The decoration recognized extraordinary heroism during aerial combat missions. He also received other decorations for his service, including the Silver Star and multiple Distinguished Flying Cross awards. By the time McConnell returned to the United States, his reputation had spread well beyond the fighter squadrons that operated in Korea. He approached flying the same way he had approached it from the beginning of his career: carefully, professionally, and without unnecessary noise. When Joseph McConnell returned to the United States, the Korean War was still continuing, but his combat tour had ended. He had achieved something few pilots in the jet age had managed. 16 confirmed victories placed him at the top of the list of American fighter pilots from the conflict. The Air Force assigned him to George Air Force Base in California. At bases like George, experienced pilots helped train new aviators and continued flying operational aircraft. The Air Force also used well-known combat pilots to represent the service during public appearances. The early 1950s were a time of rapid change in military aviation. Jet fighters were becoming faster and more powerful with each new design. Engineers were constantly modifying aircraft in an effort to improve performance, increase range, and adapt them to new missions. These improvements required experienced pilots to test and evaluate the aircraft. Test flying could be just as dangerous as combat. Pilots flew aircraft that were sometimes fresh from the factory or equipped with new systems that hadn't yet been proven in flight. Unexpected mechanical problems could develop at any time. McConnell eventually became involved in testing one of the newest versions of the Sabre fighter. This aircraft was known as the F-86H, a redesigned version of the fighter that had already proven itself during the Korean War. The new model was intended to operate in a fighter-bomber role and carried heavier weapons than earlier versions. Like many experimental or newly modified aircraft, the F-86H still had technical issues that engineers were working to resolve. On August 25, 1954, McConnell took off from Edwards Air Force Base in one of these aircraft for a test flight. During McConnell's flight, something went wrong. The aircraft developed serious control problems. McConnell attempted to recover the aircraft and bring it back toward the base, but the situation continued to worsen. Eventually, he was forced to eject. The aircraft was still relatively low to the ground when he left the cockpit. At low altitude, parachutes sometimes don't have enough time to deploy fully before reaching the ground. That's what happened during McConnell's final flight. Joseph McConnell was killed instantly when he struck the ground. He was 31 years old. Joseph McConnell's combat career lasted only a few months. Between January and May 1953, he destroyed 16 enemy fighters in the skies over Korea. That record made Joseph C. McConnell Jr. the highest-scoring American ace of the Korean War and one of the most successful jet fighter pilots the United States Air Force had ever produced. His victories came during a period when jet combat was still new. Pilots were learning how to fight at speeds that earlier generations of aviators had never experienced. Every engagement demanded quick decisions, steady nerves, and precise flying. McConnell proved he could do all three. His success didn't come from dramatic maneuvers or reckless attacks. Fellow pilots described him as calm and deliberate, a man who relied on careful positioning and patience rather than showmanship. When the moment to strike appeared, he took it. That approach carried him to 16 victories in only 4 months. Yet the end of his story reminds us how dangerous aviation remained during the early jet age. The aircraft he flew after the war represented the next generation of military technology, but those machines were still being tested and refined. Pilots like McConnell helped push aviation forward, often at considerable risk. Today, his name remains part of American fighter aviation history, not only as the top American ace of the Korean War, but as a pilot whose persistence carried him from a young man waiting for a chance to fly to one of the most accomplished fighter pilots of the jet era. I'm Dave. I appreciate you watching. Please like, subscribe, comment, and share. And until next time, stand tall.
He's a Dave, dude. Dave's got to stick together, you know what I mean?